The summer of 1991 started like any other for 8-year-old Billy. His mom had packed his favorite clothes into a small suitcase, and his dad had driven him 3 hours to Uncle Jack's farm in the countryside. Billy loved these summer visits, more than anything else in the world. Uncle Jack's farm was like a magical place for kids. It had 40 acres of land with thick woods, old barns that smelled like hay, and fields that seemed to go on forever. There were chickens running around, a big red barn that creaked in the wind, and best of all, lots of places to explore and play. Billy wasn't alone on the farm. His 4 cousins lived there too. There was Lisa, who was 12, and always acted like she was the boss of everyone. Then came Tony, who was 10 and loved to climb trees higher than anyone else dared. There was also little Katie, who was only 6, but could run faster than boys twice her age. And finally, there was Danny, who was also 10 like Tony, and happened to be Billy's very best friend in the whole world. The boys had grown up together during these summer visits. They knew every corner of the farm, every hiding spot in the barns, and every path through the woods. They had built tree houses together, caught frogs in the pond, and shared countless adventures that only cousins who are best friends can have. For the first 2 weeks of July, life was perfect. The kids would wake up early, eat Aunt Mary's pancakes, and then disappear into their world of games and exploration. They played cowboys and Indians, built forts out of hay bales, and raced their bikes down the dusty farm roads. The adults would barely see them except for meals and bedtime. Uncle Jack was a kind man who loved having all the children around. He would tell them stories about when he was young, teach them how to milk the cows, and sometimes take them fishing at the big pond on the far side of the property. Aunt Mary would bake cookies and always had bandages ready for scraped knees and elbows. The farm felt safe and happy. It was the kind of place where parents didn't worry about their kids because there was nowhere for them to get into real trouble. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away, and the only road was the long gravel driveway that led to the main highway. July 15th started just like any other day. The sun was shining bright, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The kids had spent the morning building a new fort in the hayloft of the big barn. They had used old wooden boxes and hay bales to create what they called their secret headquarters. After lunch, they decided to explore the eastern part of the property, which they didn't visit as often. This area was more wild and overgrown. The trees grew thicker there, and there were old stone walls from farms that existed long before Uncle Jack bought the land. Sometimes they would find old bottles or pieces of metal that looked like they came from another time. As the afternoon got later, the air started to cool down just a little bit. The sun was still bright, but it was getting lower in the sky. This was always the best time for outdoor games because it wasn't too hot anymore, but there was still plenty of light to play. It was Lisa who suggested hide and seek. She said they should play one big game before dinner, and everyone thought that was a great idea. They had played this game hundreds of times on the farm, and they all knew the best hiding spots. The rules were simple. One person would be it, and would count to 50 while leaning against the big oak tree near the house. Everyone else would run and hide anywhere on the property, except inside the main house or the animal pens. The person who was it had to find everyone else, and the last person found would be it for the next game. Billy volunteered to be it first. He was good at seeking, and he actually enjoyed the challenge of finding everyone. He pressed his face against the rough bark of the old oak tree and started counting slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Behind him, he could hear the sound of feet running in different directions. Someone giggled. Someone else shushed them. He could hear the barn door creak open and then slam shut. More footsteps on gravel, then silence. 35, 36, 37. Billy kept counting, but part of his mind was already thinking about where everyone might hide. Lisa usually went to the same spot behind the chicken coop. Tony always tried to climb up somewhere high. Little Katie liked to hide under things. And Danny was creative. He always found spots that nobody else thought of. 48, 49, 50. Ready or not, here I come. Billy turned around and looked at the farm spread out before him. Everything looked quiet and peaceful, no movement anywhere. They were all hidden well. He decided to start with the easy spots first. Sure enough, he found Lisa behind the chicken coop, trying not to laugh as the chickens walked around her feet. She rolled her eyes when he tagged her, like she had let him find her on purpose. Next, he found Tony in the hayloft, lying flat on his stomach behind some hay bales. Tony grinned when Billy spotted him and jumped down from the loft like he was proud of his hiding spot. Little Katie was under the front porch, curled up in a tiny ball behind one of the wooden support posts. She giggled when Billy found her and crawled out, brushing dust off her clothes. But Danny was nowhere to be found. Billy looked in all the usual spots. He checked the barn again, looked behind every building, and even climbed up to the treehouse they had built earlier that summer. No Danny. Lisa, Tony, and Katie joined him in the search. They called Danny's name, but there was no answer. They checked inside the old chicken coop, behind the woodpile, and even in the tall grass near the pond. Still nothing. Where could he be? Katie asked, starting to sound worried. He's probably found some super secret spot, Tony said. You know how Danny is. He's really good at this game. They kept looking as the sun got lower in the sky. The shadows were getting longer, and the air was getting cooler. Billy was starting to feel a little worried, but he told himself that Danny was just being really good at hiding. Maybe he had found some amazing new spot and was waiting for them to give up so he could surprise them. But as they searched, Billy noticed something strange. They had been calling Danny's name for almost an hour now, and usually, even if someone was hiding really well, they would answer when the game went on too long. Danny was competitive, but he wasn't mean. He wouldn't want to worry everyone. Danny, Billy called out louder. Come on, the game's over, we give up. Only silence answered back. The other kids were getting worried too. Katie was staying close to Lisa, and Tony had stopped joking around. They all kept calling Danny's name as they walked around the property, but there was no response. As the sun started to set, painting the sky orange and pink, Billy felt a cold feeling in his stomach. This wasn't like Danny at all. Something was wrong. We should tell the grown-ups, Lisa said quietly. They all agreed and ran back to the house. Uncle Jack was sitting on the front porch reading a newspaper. Aunt Mary was in the kitchen starting to prepare dinner. The smell of fried chicken was coming through the screen door. Uncle Jack, Billy said, trying not to sound too scared. We can't find Danny. Uncle Jack looked up from his newspaper. What do you mean you can't find him? We were playing hide and seek and he hid somewhere, but we've been looking for over an hour and we can't find him anywhere, Lisa explained. Uncle Jack's expression changed immediately. He folded his newspaper and stood up. How long has he been missing? Maybe an hour and a half, Tony said. Uncle Jack called into the house. Mary, come out here. Aunt Mary appeared at the screen door, wiping her hands on her apron. When Uncle Jack explained what happened, her face went white. Danny, she called out in a voice that was much louder than the kids had been using. Danny, come home right now. But there was no answer. Uncle Jack grabbed his flashlight from inside the house, even though it wasn't quite dark yet. Show me everywhere you've looked, he told the kids. They spent the next hour retracing their steps. Uncle Jack looked in places the kids hadn't thought of, inside the old well house, behind the machinery in the equipment shed, even in the root cellar under the house. But Danny wasn't anywhere. By the time it was full dark, both Uncle Jack and Aunt Mary were really scared. Aunt Mary had tears in her eyes, and Uncle Jack's jaw was set in a hard line. I'm calling the police, Uncle Jack said. But maybe he just fell asleep somewhere, Katie said hopefully. Maybe he'll come back when he gets hungry. Uncle Jack knelt down and put his hands on Katie's shoulders. Sweetheart, Danny wouldn't stay hidden this long. He knows better than that. Something's not right. Billy felt like there was a heavy stone in his stomach. This was all his fault. If he hadn't suggested hide and seek, if he had found Danny faster, if he had looked harder. He wanted to cry, but he also wanted to keep looking. Danny had to be somewhere on the farm. He just had to be. What none of them knew was that Danny had indeed found the perfect hiding spot. Earlier that day, while they were exploring the eastern part of the property, he had noticed something interesting. Hidden, behind thick bushes and tall weeds, there was an old wooden door set into a small hill. It looked like it might be some kind of storm shelter or root cellar from long ago. During the hide-and-seek game, Danny had remembered that door. He thought it would be the most amazing hiding spot ever. Nobody would ever think to look there. He could hide inside and listen to them calling his name, and then jump out and surprise them when they gave up. The old wooden door was heavy, but Danny managed to pull it open. Inside there were stone steps leading down into darkness. It smelled musty and old, but it looked safe enough. Danny climbed down the steps and pulled the door closed behind him, grinning to himself about how clever he was being. But the old, wooden door, swollen from years of rain and moisture, clicked shut in a way it hadn't done in decades. And from the inside there was no handle to open it again. The police arrived at Uncle Jack's farm just after 10 o'clock that night. 2 officers came in a patrol car, their red and blue lights flashing across the barn and the fields. Billy had never seen police lights at the farm before, and it made everything feel scary and real in a way that hurt his chest. Officer Johnson was a tall man with kind eyes who spoke gently to the children. Officer Williams was younger and carried a big flashlight that was much brighter than Uncle Jack's. They asked the kids to tell them exactly what happened, step by step. Billy felt nervous talking to the police, but he tried to remember everything. He told them about the hide-and-seek game, about finding the other kids, and about how they had searched for Danny for over an hour before telling the adults. The officers wrote everything down in small notebooks. "Can you show us exactly where you looked?" Officer Johnson asked. So once again, they walked around the farm with flashlights, but this time it felt different. The police officers looked in places even Uncle Jack hadn't thought of. They checked every building twice, looked under farm equipment, and searched through tall grass with their bright flashlights. "Danny!" they called out every few minutes. "Danny, if you can hear us, call back. You're not in trouble." But the night stayed quiet except for the sound of crickets and the wind in the trees. More police cars arrived around midnight. Billy watched from the kitchen window as officers spread out across the property with their flashlights looking like tiny stars moving through the darkness. Aunt Mary made coffee for all the adults, and her hands shook as she poured it into cups. The police brought dogs the next morning. Billy had never seen police dogs before. They were German shepherds that looked smart and serious. The officers let the dogs smell Danny's pillow and some of his clothes, and then the dogs started following scent trails around the property. Billy followed the dogs and officers, hoping and praying that the dogs would find Danny hiding somewhere, maybe hurt, but alive. The dogs seemed excited about something near the eastern part of the property. They kept sniffing around an area where the woods got thick, but then they seemed to lose the trail near an old dirt road that ran along the edge of Uncle Jack's land. "What does that mean?" Billy asked Officer Johnson. Officer Johnson looked serious. It could mean Danny walked to that road or someone might have picked him up there. The idea that someone might have taken Danny made Billy feel sick to his stomach. Who would take a 10-year-old boy? And why? By the 3rd day, there were more police officers than Billy could count. They had big trucks with equipment, and some officers came from the state police. There was even a helicopter that flew low over the farm, making a loud noise that scared the chickens. Billy's parents drove up from the city as soon as they heard what happened. His mom hugged him tight and cried, and his dad talked to the police for a long time. They wanted to take Billy home, but he begged them to let him stay and help look for Danny. "He's my best friend," Billy told his parents. "I can't leave without him." The police interviewed everyone who lived nearby, even though the nearest neighbors were miles away. They asked if anyone had seen strangers in the area or noticed any unusual cars or trucks. They put up roadblocks and checked every vehicle that came through the area. Danny's school picture appeared on missing child posters all over the county. In the photo, Danny was smiling his big gap-toothed grin and his brown hair was messy like it always was. Billy hated seeing those posters because they made Danny's disappearance feel permanent, like he might never come home. The local newspaper wrote a story about Danny with the headline, "10-year-old boy vanishes during family game." Television news crews came to the farm and interviewed Uncle Jack and Aunt Mary. Billy watched his aunt on TV, crying as she begged for anyone with information to come forward. "Danny is a good boy," she said on television. "He's smart and careful. If someone has him, please just let him come home. We love him so much." The FBI got involved after a week. Special agents in dark suits came to the farm and asked the same questions the local police had asked, but in different ways. They brought special equipment to search the property again, including machines that could see underground. Billy heard the adults talking late at night when they thought the kids were asleep. They used words like abduction and predator that Billy didn't fully understand, but he knew they were scary words. The FBI agents talked about checking lists of dangerous people who lived in the area. Uncle Jack stopped sleeping. Billy would see him walking around the property at all hours with a flashlight calling Danny's name. Sometimes Billy would find his uncle sitting on the front porch at 3 a.m, just staring out at the fields like he was waiting for Danny to come walking home. Aunt Mary stopped cooking big meals. She would make sandwiches for everyone, but she barely ate anything herself. She lost weight quickly and her clothes started hanging loose on her small frame. She would start crying at random times, like when she was folding laundry and came across one of Danny's shirts. After 2 weeks, most of the police officers left. Officer Johnson came by every few days to check on the family and ask if anyone had remembered anything new. The FBI agents went back to their offices in the city, but they promised they weren't giving up. Billy's parents finally took him home at the end of July. He didn't want to leave, but his mom said he needed to get ready for school and try to have some normal life. The drive home was the longest 3 hours of Billy's life. He kept looking back, hoping to see Danny running after their car. School started in September, but Billy couldn't concentrate on anything. His teachers were patient with him because they knew what had happened, but Billy felt like he was living in a fog. He would sit in class and think about Danny, wondering where he was and if he was scared. Billy's parents took him to talk to a counselor, a nice lady named Mrs. Peterson who specialized in helping children deal with difficult situations. She had toys and games in her office, but Billy just wanted to talk about Danny and ask the same questions over and over. "Why can't the police find him?" Billy would ask. "How does a person just disappear?" Mrs. Peterson was honest with him. "Sometimes bad things happen that we can't explain," she said. "But that doesn't mean we stop caring or stop hoping." The first Christmas without Danny was terrible. Uncle Jack and Aunt Mary didn't have their usual big family gathering. Instead, Billy's family had a quiet dinner at home. There was an empty chair at the table where Danny should have been sitting, and nobody talked about it, but everyone was thinking about it. Years went by, and the case got colder. Officer Johnson retired, and new officers took over Danny's case. They would call Uncle Jack every few months to let him know they hadn't forgotten, but there were never any new leads to follow. Billy grew up carrying the weight of that summer day. He felt guilty, even though everyone told him it wasn't his fault. If he had been a better seeker, if he had found Danny faster, if he had suggested a different game, the what-ifs followed him everywhere. Uncle Jack became obsessed with finding Danny. He spent his savings hiring private investigators who promised they could solve the case. He traveled to other states following leads that turned out to be false hopes. He consulted with psychics and anyone else who claimed they could help find missing children. Some of the private investigators were honest people who tried their best. Others took Uncle Jack's money and disappeared themselves. But Uncle Jack couldn't stop trying. Every lead, no matter how small or unlikely, had to be followed. Aunt Mary handled her grief differently. She became very quiet and spent most of her time in Danny's room, which she kept exactly the way it was the day he disappeared. His clothes were still in the dresser, his bed was still made, and his favorite stuffed animal still sat on his pillow. The annual summer visits to the farm stopped completely. The other cousins grew up and went to college, got married, and started their own families. But the family never gathered at Uncle Jack's farm again. There were too many memories there, and too much pain. Billy became a police officer when he grew up, partly because of what happened to Danny. He specialized in missing persons cases because he understood what families went through in a way that most officers couldn't. He knew the sleepless nights, the false hopes, and the way grief could consume a family. Every case Billy worked on, he thought about Danny. He worked harder on missing children cases than any other officer in his department. He would follow leads that other officers might give up on, and he would spend his own time and money when the department's resources ran out. Billy solved several missing person cases during his career, and each time he reunited a family, he thought about Uncle Jack and Aunt Mary. He wondered if someday someone would bring Danny home to them. By 2010, almost 20 years had passed since Danny disappeared. Lisa had become a teacher and had 3 children of her own. Tony worked as a mechanic and lived 2 states away. Little Katie, who wasn't little anymore, had become a nurse and rarely talked about that summer. Billy was 37 years old and had been a police officer for 15 years. He was married to a wonderful woman named Rachel, who understood why he couldn't talk about certain cases without getting emotional. They had 2 children of their own, and Billy was extremely protective of them. Uncle Jack was in his 60s, and his hair had turned completely gray. He still lived on the farm, but he had sold most of the animals and rented out the fields to other farmers. The house felt empty and sad. Nothing like the happy place it had been when the children would visit. Some family members had started to accept that they might never know what happened to Danny. It was too painful to keep hoping after so many years of disappointment. But Uncle Jack refused to give up. He kept a missing person poster with Danny's school picture on his kitchen table, and he still drove around the county sometimes looking for any sign of his son. "I'll never stop looking," Uncle Jack would tell anyone who would listen. "He's my boy, and I'll find him someday." Billy admired his uncle's determination, but he also worried about him. Uncle Jack had spent half his life and all of his money trying to find Danny. The obsession was slowly destroying what was left of his family, but nobody knew how to help him let go. Nobody imagined that the answer they had been searching for was less than 100 yards from where they ate dinner every night, hidden beneath years of overgrown brush and forgotten by time itself. By the spring of 2023, Uncle Jack was 75 years old. His back was bent from years of hard work, and his hands shook slightly when he held his coffee cup. But his eyes still held the same determined look they had held for 32 years. He still kept Danny's missing person poster on his kitchen table, and he still believed that someday he would find his son. The old farmhouse had become too much for Uncle Jack to manage alone. The roof needed repairs, the paint was peeling, and weeds had taken over much of the property. Aunt Mary had passed away 5 years earlier, and Uncle Jack had been living alone since then, surrounded by memories and fading hope. His children, who were still alive, had been trying to convince him to sell the farm and move to a smaller place in town, but Uncle Jack refused. "What if Danny comes home and I'm not here?" he would say. "What if someone finds a clue and I've moved away?" Finally, Uncle Jack's doctor and his remaining family convinced him that he needed help. His heart wasn't strong anymore, and living alone on the big property wasn't safe. With tears in his eyes, Uncle Jack agreed to sell the farm, but only to people who promised to take care of it. The new owners were a young couple named Mike and Jennifer Roberts. They had always dreamed of having a country wedding venue, and they thought Uncle Jack's property would be perfect. The old farmhouse could be restored, the barn could host receptions, and the fields could be turned into gardens for outdoor ceremonies. Mike was a contractor who specialized in restoring old buildings, and Jennifer was the event planner who had a vision for creating magical weddings in the countryside. They were kind people who listened carefully when Uncle Jack told them about Danny's disappearance. "We'll take good care of this place," Jennifer promised Uncle Jack. "And if we ever find anything that might help you learn what happened to your son, we'll call you immediately." Uncle Jack moved to a small apartment in town in February 2023. It was the first time in over 50 years that he hadn't lived on the farm. Billy helped him pack his belongings, and both men cried as they loaded boxes into the truck. Mike and Jennifer started working on the property in March. They had big plans, but they knew it would take time to restore everything. The farmhouse needed new wiring, new plumbing, and a new roof. The barn needed structural repairs, and the entire property needed to be cleaned up and landscaped. They hired a surveying company to map out exactly where the property lines were and to identify any potential problems with the land. They also brought in a crew of workers to clear away decades of overgrown vegetation and abandoned farm equipment. The eastern part of the property was the most overgrown. Trees and bushes had been growing wild there for years, and there were old stone walls and piles of rusty metal that needed to be cleaned up. Mike decided to start the cleanup work there because it would be the most difficult and time-consuming part of the project. On March 15, 2023, Mike was working with a crew of 4 men to clear the thick brush near the eastern edge of the property. They had chainsaws and heavy equipment to remove the larger trees and bushes that had grown out of control. One of the workers, a man named Pete who had been doing land clearing for 20 years, noticed something unusual. Behind a tangle of thick vines and bushes, there appeared to be some kind of structure built into a small hill. "Hey, Mike," Pete called out. "Come look at this." Mike walked over and saw what Pete was pointing at. There was definitely something, man-made there, but it was almost completely hidden by vegetation. It looked like it might be an old storm cellar or root cellar from many years ago. "That's interesting," Mike said. "I wonder how old it is." They spent the next hour carefully cutting away the vines and bushes that were covering the structure. What they found was a heavy wooden door set into the hillside, just like Pete had thought. The door looked very old and was weathered gray from years of exposure to rain and snow. "Should we open it?" asked one of the other workers. Mike thought about it for a moment. He was curious, but he also wanted to be careful. Old structures like this could be dangerous. The ceiling might have collapsed, or there could be dangerous gases inside. "Let's be careful," Mike said. "Pete, can you help me try to open this door?" The wooden door was swollen and stuck tight. Mike and Pete had to use crowbars to pry it open. As they worked, Mike wondered if Uncle Jack knew about this old cellar. It was possible that it had been built long before Uncle Jack bought the property, and maybe he had never known it existed. When they finally got the door open, a musty smell came out that made them all step back. Mike shined his flashlight down into the opening and saw stone steps leading down into darkness. "It's definitely some kind of old cellar," Mike said. "Probably built as a storm shelter back in the 1940s or 1950s. The space inside was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with stone walls and a dirt floor." Mike's flashlight beam moved around the space, and at first, everything looked empty except for some old spider webs and debris that had fallen from the ceiling over the years. But then Mike's light caught something that made his heart stop. In the far corner of the cellar, there was a small pile of bones, and next to the bones there were pieces of fabric that looked like they might have once been clothing. The fabric was faded and rotted, but Mike could see that it might have been a child's shirt and pants. "Oh my God," Mike whispered. Pete looked over Mike's shoulder and saw what he was seeing. "Is that—" "Don't touch anything," Mike said, his voice shaking. "We need to call the police right now." Mike climbed back up the stone steps and immediately called 911 on his cell phone. His hands were shaking as he dialed the numbers. "1. What's your emergency?" "This is Mike Roberts at 1247 County Road 15, Mike said. "We're doing construction work and we found what looks like human remains in an old cellar." The 911 operator asked Mike to stay on the line and not to let anyone go back into the cellar until the police arrived. Mike told his crew to stop all work immediately and to stay away from the area. 20 minutes later, the first police car arrived. Officer Davis was a young officer who had never worked a case like this before. He looked down into the cellar with his flashlight and immediately called for backup and for the county coroner. Within an hour, there were 6 police cars at the farm, along with the coroner's van and a truck from the state crime lab. The area around the old cellar was blocked off with yellow tape, and nobody except the investigators was allowed to get close. Detective Rodriguez was the lead investigator on the case. She was an experienced officer who had worked many difficult cases, but she had a feeling this discovery might be connected to one of the area's most famous unsolved mysteries. "How long has this property been in the same family?" Detective Rodriguez asked Mike. "The previous owner, Jack Thompson, lived here for over 50 years, Mike said. He told us that his son disappeared on this property back in 1991 during a family gathering." Detective Rodriguez felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard about the Danny Thompson case, even though it happened before she joined the police force. Every officer in the county knew about the 10-year-old boy who had vanished while playing hide-and-seek and was never found. The crime scene team worked carefully to document everything in the cellar before removing anything. They took hundreds of photographs and measured every inch of the space. They found the small skeleton, pieces of rotted clothing, and something else that would prove to be the most important discovery of all. In one corner of the cellar, protected, Inside an old metal lunchbox, they found a small notebook. The notebook was damaged by moisture and time, but much of it was still readable. The pages contained childish handwriting in pencil that had faded but could still be made out. Detective Rodriguez carefully opened the notebook and began to read. What she found made tears come to her eyes. The first entry was dated July 15, 1991, and it said, "I found the best hiding place ever. Nobody will ever find me here. This is going to be so cool when I surprise everyone." The next entry was from the same day, but later. "I've been hiding for a long time now. I can hear people calling my name, but they sound really far away. I tried to open the door, but it won't move. I think it's stuck." As Detective Rodriguez continued reading, the story became clear and heartbreaking. Danny had found the old storm cellar during the hide-and-seek game and thought it would be the perfect hiding spot. But when he pulled the heavy wooden door closed behind him, it had swollen shut and trapped him inside. The notebook entries showed that Danny had tried everything he could think of to get out. He had pushed on the door with all his strength. He had piled up stones to try to reach a higher part of the door. He had even tried digging at the floor, hoping to find another way out. For the first few days, Danny had remained hopeful. His writing showed that he believed someone would find him soon. He wrote about hearing voices calling his name, but the thick stone walls and earth around the cellar had muffled his cries for help. Day 3, one entry said, "I'm getting really hungry and thirsty. I hope someone finds me soon. I tried yelling as loud as I could, but I don't think anyone can hear me." The later entries became shorter and weaker. Danny wrote about being scared and missing his family. He wrote messages to his parents telling them he loved them and that he was sorry for hiding in such a dangerous place. The final entry, written in very faint pencil, simply said, "I love you, Mom and Dad. I love you, Uncle Jack and Aunt Mary. Tell Billy and the others I'm sorry." Detective Rodriguez had to step outside for a few minutes to compose herself. In all her years as a police officer, she had never read anything so heartbreaking. This little boy had spent his final days alone and scared, probably just a few yards, away from people who were desperately searching for him. The medical examiner confirmed that the remains were those of a child approximately 10 years old. DNA testing would be needed to make a positive identification, but Detective Rodriguez was already certain they had found Danny Thompson. The hardest part was calling Uncle Jack to tell him what they had found. Detective Rodriguez drove to his apartment in town and knocked on his door personally. When Uncle Jack answered, she could see in his eyes that he knew why she was there. "We found him," she said gently. "We found Danny." Uncle Jack stood in his doorway for a long moment, not saying anything. Then he slowly sat down in a chair and put his face in his hands. He cried for several minutes while Detective Rodriguez sat with him. "Where was he?" Uncle Jack finally asked. "In an old storm cellar on your property," Detective Rodriguez said. "It was completely hidden by vegetation. He was probably there the whole time." Uncle Jack looked up at her with tears streaming down his face. "You mean he was there all those years, while we were searching everywhere else?" Detective Rodriguez nodded. "It appears that he found the cellar during the hide-and-seek game and got trapped inside when the door stuck shut. We found a notebook where he wrote about what happened. The truth was both a relief and a devastating blow. After 32 years of wondering, Uncle Jack finally had his answer. But the answer was more heartbreaking than anything he had imagined. His son had been so close to home, so close to help, but nobody had known the old cellar existed. The news of Danny's discovery spread quickly through the small community. Within hours, reporters from local television stations were calling Uncle Jack, and by the next morning, news crews had set up outside his apartment building. The story, that had captivated the region 32 years earlier, was making headlines once again. Billy was at work when he got the phone call from Detective Rodriguez. He was 40 years old now, a seasoned police detective with gray streaks in his hair and lines around his eyes from years of difficult cases. But when he heard the news about Danny, he felt like that 8-year-old boy again, standing in Uncle Jack's farmyard and calling his cousin's name. "We need you to come and identify some items we found with the remains," Detective Rodriguez said gently. "I know this is difficult, but you knew Danny better than almost anyone." Billy took the rest of the day off and drove to the county sheriff's office. In a small, quiet room, Detective Rodriguez showed him Danny's notebook and the few personal items that had survived 32 years in the cellar. There was a small pocket knife that Danny always carried, a metal toy car that was rusty but still recognizable, and a friendship bracelet that Billy himself had made for Danny the summer before he disappeared. Seeing these items hit Billy harder than he had expected. He remembered giving Danny that friendship bracelet, made from colored string during a rainy afternoon when they were bored. Danny had worn it every day that summer, proud that his best friend had made it specially for him. "It's him," Billy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's definitely Danny's stuff." The DNA results came back 3 days later, confirming what everyone already knew. The remains found in the old storm cellar were those of Danny Thompson, who had been missing for 32 years, 4 months, and 18 days. Uncle Jack wanted to read Danny's notebook himself, but Detective Rodriguez warned him that it would be very difficult. Uncle Jack insisted, saying he needed to know exactly what his son had gone through. Reading Danny's final words was the hardest thing Uncle Jack had ever done. He sat in his small apartment, holding the photocopied pages with shaking hands, learning about his son's last days. Danny had written about being scared, about missing his family, and about hoping someone would find him. But he had also written about good memories, fishing trips with his dad, his mom's cooking, and playing with his cousins. "I wish I could tell Dad about the big fish I saw in the pond yesterday," one entry read. "It was huge, probably bigger than the one we caught last summer." Another entry said, "I hope Mom isn't too worried about me. I didn't mean to scare everyone. I just wanted to find the best hiding spot ever." The notebook showed that Danny had been a brave little boy who had tried to stay positive even in his darkest moments. He had tried to keep track of the days by making marks on the stone wall, and he had written little messages to each family member, telling them things he wanted them to know. Uncle Jack cried as he read every word, but he was also proud of his son's courage. Even at 10 years old, facing the scariest situation imaginable, Danny had thought about his family and had tried to stay strong. The funeral was held on a beautiful spring day in April 2023. The same church where the family had prayed for Danny's safe return 32 years earlier was packed with people. Some were family members and old friends who had never forgotten about Danny. Others were community members who had followed the story over the years. There were also people who had never met Danny, but were moved by his story. Billy gave a speech at the funeral, talking about his cousin and best friend. He told stories about their adventures on the farm, their shared dreams, and the kind of person Danny had been growing up to become. "Danny was the kind of kid who would give you his last piece of candy if you were sad," Billy said. "He was brave and funny and loyal. He would have grown up to be an amazing man, the kind of person who made the world better just by being in it." Lisa, Tony, and Katie were all there, now adults with families of their own. They each shared memories of that last summer, talking about the games they played and the fun they had before everything changed. For the first time in 32 years, they were able to talk about Danny without it being about his disappearance. They could remember him as the happy, playful boy he had been. Uncle Jack spoke last. He was frail and his voice was weak, but his words were strong. "For 32 years, I searched for my boy," he said. "I never stopped believing I would find him someday. I just wish I could have found him in time to save him, but I'm grateful that he's finally coming home. Danny was the light of our lives, and even though he's been gone all these years, that light never went out." Danny was buried in the family plot at the town cemetery next to Aunt Mary and his grandparents. His headstone was simple but meaningful. "Danny Thompson, beloved son and cousin, you found your way home at last." After the funeral, the family gathered at a local restaurant to share more memories and to begin the process of healing. It was the first time in over 30 years that they had all been together for something related to Danny that wasn't about searching or hoping or grieving without answers. Mike and Jennifer, the new owners of the farm, attended the funeral and approached Uncle Jack afterward. They had been deeply affected by the discovery and wanted to do something meaningful to honor Danny's memory. "We'd like to create a memorial garden on the farm," Jennifer said. Somewhere peaceful where family and friends can come to remember. Danny, Uncle Jack was touched by their offer. That would mean everything to me, he said. Over the next few months, Mike and Jennifer worked with the family to design a beautiful memorial garden near where the old storm cellar had been located. They planted Danny's favorite flowers, sunflowers and black-eyed Susans, and installed a small bench with a plaque that read, "In memory of Danny Thompson, may all who are lost find their way home." The garden became a place of peace and reflection. Uncle Jack visited regularly, sometimes bringing fresh flowers or just sitting quietly on the bench. Other family members came too, and sometimes strangers who had heard Danny's story would stop by to pay their respects. The discovery of Danny's remains and the truth about what happened had a profound impact on how missing person searches were conducted in the area. Billy worked with his police department to develop new protocols for searching rural properties, with special attention to old structures that might be hidden or forgotten. Danny's case taught us that we need to be more thorough in our searches, Billy explained to other officers. We can't assume that because a structure looks abandoned or overgrown, it's not worth checking. Every building, every cellar, every possible hiding place needs to be investigated. The sheriff's department invested in ground-penetrating radar, equipment and trained officers in how to identify old structures that might not be visible from the surface. They also created partnerships with local historical societies to learn about old buildings and structures that might exist on properties being searched. Billy's work on improving search protocols became a model for other police departments across the state. He gave presentations at law enforcement conferences, always starting with Danny's story and explaining how one overlooked hiding place had led to 32 years of unanswered questions. Uncle Jack lived for 2 more years after Danny's funeral. The closure of finally knowing what happened to his son seemed to give him a kind of peace he hadn't had in decades. He spent his final years sharing stories about Danny with anyone who would listen, making sure his son's memory stayed alive. When Uncle Jack passed away in 2025, he was buried next to Danny and Aunt Mary. His headstone simply read, "Jack Thompson, devoted father, never stopped looking." Billy inherited some of Uncle Jack's personal belongings, including a box of letters and cards that people had sent to the family over the years. There were letters from other families who had missing children, offering support and understanding. There were cards from strangers who had seen the news stories and wanted to let the family know they were thinking of them. One letter particularly moved Billy. It was from a woman whose daughter had gone missing 5 years earlier. She wrote, "Your family's story gives me hope that someday I'll have answers too. Thank you for never giving up on Danny. It shows the rest of us that love never stops, even when hope feels impossible." Billy realized that Danny's story had touched thousands of people over the years. Families facing similar tragedies had found strength in Uncle Jack's determination and love. The case had also led to improvements in how missing children cases were handled, potentially helping other families find their loved ones more quickly. The farm that Mike and Jennifer purchased was successfully converted into a wedding venue, just as they had planned. They kept their promise to take care of the property and to honor its history. Danny's memorial garden became a special part of the venue, and many couples asked to have their wedding photos taken there because they found the story of love and determination inspiring. Every July 15th, on the anniversary of the day Danny disappeared, the family gathered at his memorial garden. They would bring flowers, share stories, and remember not just the tragedy of his loss, but the joy he had brought to their lives during his 10 short years. Billy's own children grew up hearing stories about their cousin Danny, whom they had never met, but felt like they knew. Billy made sure they understood the importance of family, of never giving up on the people you love, and of cherishing every moment together. The old storm cellar was filled in and covered over, but the memorial garden remained as a testament to Danny's life and to the love of a family that never stopped searching. Visitors often remarked on the peaceful feeling of the garden and the sense that love really is stronger than loss. Danny's story became part of the local history, told and retold as an example of how a community can come together in times of crisis and how love and determination can eventually lead to truth, even when that truth takes 32 years to emerge. In the end, Danny did find his way home. Not in the way his family had hoped and prayed for, but in a way that brought peace to their hearts and meaning to their long years of searching. His story reminded everyone who heard it that some mysteries do get solved, that love never gives up, and that even in the darkest times there can eventually be light.